There once was a young boy who was born in a small town in the south of Spain to a family of librarians. The library was all he knew, and he was honored to know it. Within the four walls that made up his universe, he was destined to be the master, its alpha and omega. It was in the comfort of his library that he had found peace. However, one night, when the young boy had already grown into a young man, he had a dream about buried treasure that awaited him in a far-off land. At first the young man ignored it, but the dream came back every night and occupied his mind during the day. Like in all things that troubled him, the young man turned to the library for answers, and he found a book that taught him that recurring dreams like this were akin to messages from the great spirit of the universe that awaited us all. That he had a destiny set out before him, and that it was his responsibility to chase his dream. This treasure must have been that destiny, the journey his responsibility. And so the young man said goodbye to his father, packed his few belongings, and set off on his adventure. He made it all the way to the edge of town to a spot right before buildings gave way to tall grass. With his whole life on his back and the sun on his face, there was nothing but open road before him. But, for some reason, the young man could not convince himself to take another step. He looked back and saw his library. Its shingles gleamed in the light. Why would he leave his precious library, his birthright behind, for a dream of treasure that probably didn't exist? What kind of fool would I have to be to deny my secure life in search of some foolish dream, he asked himself. He sat down and grappled with his decision all day and into the night, eventually deciding that a safe life was better. And so, the young boy, content with his decision and convinced that it was the smart one, walked back to the library and resumed his young life with his father. Many years passed, and the young boy had become a man within his own right. His father, God rest him, passed away and left the library to his son. It was lonely work, but now the man had truly come into the fullness of his chosen destiny. He learned to enjoy the solitude of the library, the way the books smelled, how light caught dust in the air as it shined, the way the building seemed to breathe in and of its own right. Despite this settlement, one night the dream of his treasure from his youth came back to him, only now the treasure was slightly further away. At first the man ignored it. Too much was to be done, and it was as silly a prospect now as it was all those years before, if not more so. Still, the dream came and went every night for a month, stirring up a desire to be in communion with the universe that the man had not felt since he was a young man. And so, once more, the man gathered up his things, locked up the library, and embarked on the road. He made it all the way to the edge of town, to the exact spot from those long years before, and he felt a pang of doubt swell up within him. When I was a young man, I could have left, he thought. There was still someone to watch the library while I would have been away. But now I am the sole caretaker. It is my duty to tend to that building. And so the man, content with his decision and convinced that it was the right one, walked back to the library and resumed his life. Many more years passed, and the librarian, now an old man, rarely dreamed at all. His life rose and set with the library, and since the passing of his father, he had expanded the library remarkably. It was no longer a thing that had just inherited him, nor raised him, but it was now something that he had nurtured and given his life to. It was as much a part of him as he was of it, and it owned him in all the ways that he owned it, and the library would decide where he would one day die as it decided where he lived. The old man was happy with this deal with fate. Many others were not as well off as him, and many more still had fallen while grasping at great heights like fools. Besides, the world needed librarians after all, and he was deeply respected by his town for his profession. However, one day, a young shepherd had passed through his town. He said he was on his way to see the pyramids in Egypt and wanted to stop to trade his book in for another so he could read a new story along the way. Upon further conversation with the shepherd, the old man was informed by him that a great and terrible storm was brewing that night, and that the old man should be careful. "How do you know this?" the old man asked, and the shepherd simply smiled and calmly replied, "I have dreamed it." But the librarian's face must have hinted at the fact that he was not convinced by this answer, and so the shepherd continued, "As it is a librarian's business to know books and how to tend to them, It is also a shepherd's business to know the lay of the land and the weather for the sake of my sheep." And this made much more sense to the old man, who promptly nodded and thanked him for the warning and wished the shepherd luck on his journey. However, as the shepherd was leaving through the door, the old man could not help but feel a touch of envy for the freedom that the shepherd had, to go where he liked, to chase his dreams, and to listen to the signs of fate. That night, the shepherd's prophecy proved true. There was a great and terrible storm, and the constant thunderclaps and strikes of lightning kept the old man awake in fear, until finally one hit so close to the library that it shook the very earth and disoriented the old man. It was only after regaining his senses that the old man realized that the lightning had in fact struck his library, setting fire to it. But try as he may to put the flames out, years and years of ensuring the books remained dry only helped to spread the fire further, until the building itself was engulfed in flames. The old man, with no choice but to save his own life, escaped through the door before he was trapped under the burning heap. He was that library. His whole identity, his ability to make sense of himself, was that building. It was the rock upon which he built his existence, and now it was in flames. And in a fit of anger, he yelled at the sky, asking why it was that God had damned him, and what reason could God possibly have for doing this to him. But there was no answer. The old man's failure to elicit a response was only accompanied by the sound of rain softly landing around him. Beaten down and defeated, the old man collapsed in a complete and utter grief in the street next to the smoldering ruin, and for the first time in many, many years, he dreamed again of his treasure. He dreamed of a far-off land, with cities that were filled with foreign souls that were arrayed like the stars, each a chance meeting with the conscious universe. He dreamed of the great and terrible power of time and the unceremonious deaths of the countless martyrs who bore witness to truth, to dreams, and to destiny. Finally, he dreamed of his glorious treasure. He was so close he could nearly touch it, just a fingertip away, when finally the old man awoke. He sat up in the street, his library now nothing more than a smoldering mound of ash. He slowly realized that all of his possessions were now gone forever, and at first he began to cry. It was as if the tears were being ripped from him with meat hooks. But then he remembered the dream, and he knew that now he had no excuse left. Nothing was holding him back any more, and nothing was keeping him prisoner. He had hit the very bottom, and thus had become free. Suddenly he began to laugh. It was low at first, a chuckle, really, but then it grew and grew until he was roaring with giddiness and crying. With no possessions to speak of, save the clothes on his back, the shoes on his feet, and the ash on his face, he rose and slowly made his way to the edge of town. At first, he only walked, and then slowly he began to run, eventually breaking out into his first all-out sprint in many long years, shouting all along the way to anyone who would listen that he was finally free. He ran and ran until his lungs felt like they were inside out and his legs burned hotter than fire. However, much like all those years before, he arrived at the same spot, the point before the open road. The ever-intimidating gateway into the unknown loomed before him. It was the threshold of all that was alien to him, the entrance to the lion pit, a place where 1,000 times before the fear had defeated and sent him back. He was leaving a world wherein he was the master and entering the underworld, where danger and defeat lurked at every corner. A pit of whirling chaos and ambiguity where everything he learned to this point from the library would prove useless. Regardless, he took a deep breath, and putting his faith in his dream, he placed one foot in front of the other in the pursuit of the powerful presence of the divine.